Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Good to be with you, ladies and gentlemen, from the powerhouse blowtorch. That is 77 WABC, broadcasting, of course, from the center of the universe, New York City, to the world, the nation, and I'm sure even out to the cosmos. Welcome to another edition of the Dr. Sky Experience, something we like to call Theater of the Mind. And in just a moment, we'll be announcing our special guest for the 2 hours, with you and your participation at 1-800-848-9222. That's 1-800-848-9222. And a shout-out to our two helmsmen, both Tony and Bill, navigating this powerhouse signal, as I just mentioned, from the center of the universe, New York City, to you, as you would expect, ladies and gentlemen, as this winter, without a doubt, needless to remind people out there wherever you're listening, has been very, very strange indeed. The subject matter we'll get into in just a few moments, and the question we pose is climate science hijacked by incomplete data, and how is all this going to affect your finances in 2026 and beyond? But just some weather mysteries as we move deeper into the morning here on this Dr. Sky Experience edition. As we all know, Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow, but how accurate is he? His accuracy is only some 35 to 39% over the last half century. But since 1887, that is, his prediction in different iterations of Punxsutawney Phil, predicting the end of winter 109 times, the accuracy of Punxsutawney Phil has only been some 39%. But temperatures around the nation and around the world, Phoenix, Arizona here, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Ottawa, Canada, where our special guest in a moment will be talking with Tom Harris, of the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, New York City, 25 degrees Fahrenheit. But I thought I'd go into the highest and lowest temperatures around the world in the last 24 hours. If you were in beautiful Australia, in an area known as Paraburdu Aero, the temperature today was 112.1 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the complementary opposite side, the lowest temperature in the world, believe it or not, was in a small village and outpost in Russia called Denyankir. The temperature, unbelievable as it sounds, minus 63.58 degrees Fahrenheit, and you know that means below zero. And also on the surface of the sun, an amazing series with a massive sunspot group known as Active Region 4366 has blasted out toward the Earth and is still not done with us. 8 large X-flares from the small X1, an X8, an X3, an X2, another X2, and an X4. And we'll be discussing that and so much more. But a little bit of a background on our regular guest, Tom Harris. Tom Harris is Executive Director at the Ottawa, Canada-based International Climate Science Coalition and a policy advisor to the Heartland Institute. He has 40 years of experience as a mechanical engineer, project manager, science and technology communications professional, technical trainer, and advisor to a former opposition senior environmental critic in Canada's Parliament. His website, we encourage you to go to with your questions and comments, ladies and gentlemen, on a wide variety, a plethora of subjects at 1-800-848-9222. His website throughout the show and beyond, icsc-canada.com. Tom Harris, good morning in the cold climate of Canada. Thank you for joining with us this morning and this evening. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. It's warmed up to minus 15. We had a balmy day today.
That's incredible, my friend. And, you know, it's interesting for people who may not know this, and I know this is something you have a lot of experience from your side, of discussing with people. And we always like to say this, if people disagree with the content, meaning the subject of climate change or climate science, however you want to say it, we welcome what? The conversation for people who disagree. And it's always good to listen to their thoughts and provide the opposite side of the equation. But let's talk a little bit about this polar vortex and put it in perspective so people kind of understand what it is. There is science behind it, but please continue and give us a little education on what's happening with this polar vortex.
Yeah, sure. There's a current of air, like a donut, that sits over both poles, North and South Pole, and it's called the polar vortex, and the air whips around, and it acts to hold the very cold air right at the poles. And we're talking about air from Siberia and places like that. But when it weakens, when it slows down, it tends to wobble. And it causes the jet stream, which is another current of air that's a bit further south, the polar jet stream, to then start to bend down into the United States. Now, the interesting thing is that polar jet stream is actually like a wall that holds the cold air up. And what's happened just recently is the jet stream has become very wobbly because the polar vortex is weakened. And we're getting conditions now down as far as Texas that are much colder than, places on the West Coast that are normally much colder. And it's interesting because a friend of mine in southern Alberta, he was saying the temperature today was 15 degrees Celsius, which is, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And because he's below that wall, that jet stream that acts like a wall to hold that cold Arctic air north. But unfortunately, a lot of the United States, Tennessee, for example, has become very cold because that wall has slid farther, approaching the Gulf of Mexico.
Sure.
And so what you have is very cold conditions in places like Tennessee and Kentucky, certainly in New England, and much warmer conditions. We were just on the phone with somebody from San Diego, and he said that he's out biking. It's a beautiful day there.
Well, not to rub it in, Tom, the high temperature here in Phoenix throughout the past week reached an all-time high here, a record 86 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not complaining, but let's also look at Florida. And many of our friends, many people who listen to this radio station and are doing so right now. That's interesting. The poor iguanas, they were found, frozen, falling out of trees. I mean, that's horrible. And look at the citrus crop. Look at how dependent we are on what happens when weather can just wreak havoc on crops and animals, and more importantly, on animals and, of course, people, number one.
Yes, and in fact, it's interesting that the first space shuttle disaster, Challenger disaster, that occurred because it was so cold that there were icicles on the oranges, and the engineers said we didn't know whether the O-rings that were between the segments of the solid booster, we didn't know if they'd remain flexible enough to hold the hot gases in. And they told the program managers, no, you cannot launch under these conditions. We simply don't know what will happen. Sure. And because the media and others were pressuring NASA, the program managers overrode the engineers, and they launched. And sure enough, the O-rings let the gas escape. It hit the hydrogen tank in the middle, a hydrogen-oxygen tank in the middle, and it blew up and killed them all.
That's horrible, Tom. I mean, that story, I know where I was on that date back in January of 1986, and I'm sure anybody who's within our age group, or of course experienced that even as children in school, a horrific day for the American space program. And sadly, not to go too deep into it, the Apollo 1 disaster with Grissom, Young, and Chaffee in Apollo 1 on the ground in an experimental future capsule, the Apollo program, when they were literally 20 or 30 feet away due to an oxygen fire with a wire that may have sparked, and also the Columbia disaster upon reentry, having to do with what, Tom? Some kind of material that broke off at launch, hitting the left orbiter's wing, and causing the whole thing through the plasma heat to destroy that vehicle with all its inhabitants. Just horrible tragedies.
Well, and the space shuttle was quite a dangerous vehicle, actually. Feynman, Richard Feynman, the physicist, he was saying about a 1 in 50 chance of a catastrophic destruction of the shuttle on every flight, and that's about what happened. I mean, they had 100 and some odd flights, and they had 2 shuttles blow up. And it's interesting. In the case of the Apollo 1 spacecraft, I was collecting all the newspapers then. I still have them, and they had, believe it or not, 100% oxygen atmosphere, and a little spark in 100% oxygen atmosphere. Exactly. My goodness, you're in big trouble. So they actually made a lot of changes. They were cocky, actually. They thought that they could get away with almost anything. And in the case of the shuttle, though, it was simply an engineering mistake. It's interesting, Dr. Sky, they've always said that solid boosters were not safe to launch humans on because once you light them, they're like a Roman candle. You can't turn them off.
You say it so well, exactly. Many people had been under the misconception that this was chemical fuel mixed, a mixation in the engines and combustion chamber. But you're right. It was like, see if I'm right on this. It was described as having like rubber on an eraser. So you feel that gooey kind of soft material like a rubber eraser on a pencil, but it all was filled, right? So once you light it, it's going to burn all the way through till it's no longer available.
Yeah, I'm sad that the Orion spacecraft, the one they're going to launch on March 6th is the earliest they'll launch at this point because they keep, they delayed it. But it has solid boosters on the side. I mean, for a long time, until the space shuttle, they said that was way too dangerous to have people on board because, as I say, you can't control it the way you can a chemical rocket, at least a liquid-fueled rocket. And now they're going with these solid boosters again, so let's hope we don't get those troubles again.
Yes, and look, not to pick on NASA in an unfair way, but we'll be objective, and with your knowledge and the listeners out there, your questions and comments regarding subjects, ladies and gentlemen, that we'll get into. The expertise of Tom Harris as the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition talks about his version of what might be happening in the climate crisis and what's really happening in that world. We'll get to those topics. 1-800-848-9222. We will delve into the subject matter. He's a writer for so many different publications, and we'll get into an article from America Out Loud in which Tom Harris is very proud to talk about the next iteration of America moving on to the stars as we talk later about Artemis 2, a very interesting launch. And it's interesting, Tom, because that date could have been this date that we're talking about, or yesterday's date for many people in the East Coast. It was originally as early as, February 6th. So look at the launch delay. And I think the launch delay is because of some hydrogen leaks and other things we don't know about. What say you quickly on the launch delay? What do you feel the real reason is in your information?
Yeah, I think that you're right. It's exactly what you were just saying. And, this is a spacecraft that's only been used once before. It was a spacecraft that was launched in 2022 with nobody on board. They had a 15-day mission. So they're suddenly escalating that, not just to orbit. They're going to go around the back of the moon. I mean, this is a huge, huge step. So they have so much new technology that they're going to be very careful that they don't launch until they're really ready. Because, ordinarily, if you look at the sequence of events, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, you would be taking a step-by-step approach with a new rocket. They're going right from unmanned rocket to a manned mission to the moon. It's a huge step. So they're going to
four brave souls doing that.
Yeah, that's right. Amazing. Now it's interesting. They don't go that close to the moon. They're not going into lunar orbit. No. At least they hope not. If they are, they're in trouble. They're only going to be about 4,600 miles from the moon, which is it's close to the moon. But the whole point of this is to have a couple of weeks in which they can make sure that everything works before Artemis 3, which may be as soon as next year when they actually land on the southern pole of the moon. And that's a big step.
Tom, that's a miracle. And again, I don't necessarily believe there's a space race right now, but I'm sure many people out there may disagree. Or matter of fact, maybe many people may think we're not even should be or should not be doing these things with all the world's problems. We kind of think differently, but your opinions, either way, ladies and gentlemen, are most respected here. In what we call, Tom, we've changed the concept here. We call it critical thinking, but we call theater of the mind this particular radio show. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Just imagine yourself in a theater, and in this particular case, radio, theater of the mind, of course, gives us an opportunity to express our opinions and what we love in those four types of conversation. We love dialogue and critical thinking. Tom Harris, take us down the path of what's the latest going on, in your opinion, that you know about the whole climate crisis and or whatever terminology we might use, from global warming to climate crisis to all the other subjects. Well, what's some of the hot topics right now that you can report to us on?
Yeah, sure. One of the hottest topics is this idea that Canada, which is a huge part of the Earth, the surface area, has in fact made a major mistake in its temperature calculations. And we touched on this very briefly last time, but I can give you an update because what's happened is Dr. Joseph Hickey, who was a data analyst with the Bank of Canada, he was given the job in 2021 to take the temperature measurements from Environment Canada and calculate what would be the impact on the economy of those temperature changes. And what he saw in the data was that in 1998, there was a 1 degree Celsius, it's 1.6 degree Fahrenheit jump suddenly in 1 year. And he said, wow, that is a really significant thing. And is it real, or is it a data artifact caused by the instrumentation changes and things like that? Yeah. Now this is a big deal because this is supposed to be one of the best databases in the world for a very big part of the world. And if it turns out that it's wrong, it means that maybe there's a lot more wrong with the whole global temperature record. Anyway, he was working for the Bank of Canada, so he was a government employee, and he wrote to Environment Canada, and he said, look, Even your chief scientist said in 1999, I should say, in one of her papers, that if you have a 0.6 degrees Celsius rise in 1 year, that's too fast for an area as big as Canada, and it must be a data artifact. It must be a mistake introduced by changes in instrumentation or maybe changes in the locations of your temperature sensors. Well, that scientist never properly answered Joseph, but because he was working for the government, he couldn't tell the public. Well, guess what? Joseph refused to take the COVID vaccine. So they fired him. Now that was the dumbest thing they could possibly do, because he had in his mind the knowledge that most of the temperature record was probably fake. And so now he's gone public with the whole thing. He's written a paper. It's published on the web, a correlation. I'll give you the website later. And it shows that the jump cannot be real. It has to be a data artifact. So we're publicizing this as much as possible because Environment Canada are not answering. They're pretending, and you know, since 2021, even when they were told about these mistakes, they did not correct them, and they did not explain why the 1 degree change should be considered real natural change when they had previously said a temperature change of only 0.6 degrees could not be natural. So that's
interesting. That is fascinating to report to our audience here. And let me ask you this, in your opinion, of course. Is Canada now considered the poster child for politically driven climate change? I mean, was that kind of a summation of what I'm hearing in the background of what you just said? And let's hear it in your own words, what I just asked you about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's happening here is that the government has a narrative, okay? And to be able to say Canada's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world, it can sort of snow us into believing that the $200 billion that our federal government has spent since 2015 on climate change is worthwhile because Canada's, you know, experiencing this unusual temperature change. And if it turns out that that's wrong, then the foundation of their programs, and in fact the foundation of many cities across Canada, I live in Ottawa, Canada, and right in our climate change master plan, one of the excuses for what they want to spend, $54 billion on climate, is the fact that Canada is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. But if Joseph Hickey's right, and it certainly appears that he is, and Environment Canada have not shown anything wrong with what he's saying, then in fact it's not only not warming, it's actually cooled slightly since 1998. Now, this is, as I say, this is supposed to be one of the best databases of a very large area of the Earth. And so it makes you wonder how many of these mistakes are coming up, you know, across the world. So maybe this 1.2 degree change that we've been told exists across the world, maybe it's not real at all.
Well, that's interesting, Tom. Yeah, because not to cut you short here, we also talked about last time how, in your opinion, a flawed study shaped global finance. And that goes to the question that I posed here to the audience, and their response, of course, is appreciated at 1-800-848-9222. And what was that? And the question is climate science hijacked by incomplete data? And how does this affect your finances, ladies and gentlemen, in 2026 from electric? Makes sense, right? So it needs answers.
Yeah. Well, and the trouble is this. The Potsdam study came out from the Potsdam Institute in Germany. It said that there would be a 62% reduction in GDP for the world because of climate change by the year 2100. Now, that was 3 times higher than any previous estimate. And so you'd think that they'd be a little cautious before they actually accepted that study.
Precisely.
Instead, it made headlines across the world. Massive increase in damage caused by climate change were the headlines. And also they used it in deciding stress tests for banks, okay? So banks would then say, okay, wow, we're going to use this massive number for the change in GDP to decide who we're going to loan who we're going to loan money. So what you found is that oil and gas companies had a much more difficult time getting loans and getting financial arrangements. People had harder time getting insurance, all based on a study that about a year later was shown to be hugely flawed. And this is the trouble. When a study comes out that supports the narrative, it immediately gets not only widespread media attention, but they start to incorporate it into all the financial institutions, across the Western world. But then you take a report like Joseph Hickey's, where he says, hey, I'm not sure that this temperature change is even real. And the media won't even report it. In fact, it's interesting, aside from you and Rebel News and a couple of others, I've tried very hard to get media to report this Joseph Hickey report, and they won't do it. The best
Well, Tom, listen
to
me, please, and I'd say this in all due respect to you and everybody listening out there. You're always welcome here. And again, folks, if you have a disagreement with anything he's saying, that's what we like to hear, but obviously in a civilized conversation, dialogue and critical thinking. But here's something interesting, and we only have a few minutes before the hard break here, but here, I want to get this out. You mentioned before something, and just define it for us, and we can play with this thing later on after we return. The Dunning-Kruger effect has nothing to do with Freddy Krueger and the horrible movies that he was in. I knew that guy, by the way, personally. He was a great actor. But tell us about the Dunning-Kruger effect. It all relates to what? Tell us the definition of that in the study of climate science here. Tell us.
Yeah, sure. Two social scientists by the name of Dunning and Kruger. They wanted to find out what impact knowledge had on the certainty with which people considered their opinions. And they did various tests with different groups. And they had groups who knew a lot about the subject they were testing them on, and they had groups who knew absolutely nothing. And what they found was that the more, or I should say the less, a particular group knew about a subject, the more confident they were that their opinions were right. And it was quite funny because when you look at the scientists who really understand the field, they know what they don't know. They're humble. They recognize they don't really know much and that there's a lot more to know. And so those people, the experts, actually underestimated their ability to make accurate forecasts and statements. So they were modest. But the average person who knew nothing about a particular field was very confident that they were right. And we're seeing that all the time. I mean, we see that with Greta Thunberg. I mean, she hasn't even graduated high school, and yet she knows exactly what the future of the climate's going to be. We see that with Al Gore, who has no science background, and he knows exactly what it's going to be.
Well, Tom, this could also relate to the astrophysics world and quantum physics, because like you said, Richard Feynman, he also was saying the more we know about quantum physics, the less we know about it, and that whole thing applies there. But that's how interesting. It's like a snowball. You hear something or somebody heard something, it continues to expand until that snowball gets bigger and bigger, and then it almost seems like it's gospel. And then what happens? The people who really don't know the backgrounds on this stuff, they become, pretty much experts in their own way of not knowing the whole story. How can we say there's any other way to explain it? Right.
Yeah, that's right. And then you have the government decide policy, and they don't even really understand the foundations of what they're doing. And then the scientists are told by the government to go find evidence to support the policy. And, that's what's going on here, is that we have the government, in the case of the Hickey report, who've decided that Canada's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world based on very flimsy and probably incorrect data. When a scientist comes up and says, hey, I don't think that's true, he's basically told to shut up, and in this case, later fired. But so what we have is, they call it evidence-based decision-making. What I call this is decision-based evidence-making. In other words, and one of my sisters worked in a department in the government, and she was told to go find evidence to prove what the minister was saying was correct. And she came back and said, I can't find any evidence. And they said, well, go look harder, because, of course, they wanted to support what the politician had said. And that's what's going on almost all the time in the climate field.
Tom, let me throw this out. We're going to have to take the break here in just a moment. But again, here's something I think is very profound. Let both sides of this conversation come to some sort of mutual agreement on this without the hate tactics, the yelling and screaming and, blowing things up and doing that. Again, the appeal would go out there for, maybe I'm being a little ludicrous here, common sense in the conversation. So, of course, we don't want to pollute the earth, but yet if it's a economic thing that's being crammed down our throats in misinformation, maybe there's a way, at least I'm hoping, Tom, that we can all come together on these subjects. But maybe I'm a little too optimistic. What say you before we go to the break?
Well, I think people should be a lot more humble and recognize that the Earth's climate is probably the most complex natural phenomena we've ever tackled. I mean, ever. It's more complicated than the development of the atomic bomb or going to the moon. And Many of the leading scientists now say that we may never be able to properly forecast climate because they call it a coupled nonlinear system, et cetera, the complication. Yeah, but the bottom line is we can prepare for climate. We can actually adapt to climate change. We can have good, solid energy sources, so whether it's really cold or really hot, we can adapt and survive. But you know, what we're seeing across the United States now with this cold temperature is a lot of power failures because we're not adapting.
Sure are. And Tom, not to cut you short, the big break at the bottom of the hour, the hard break rules. And ladies and gentlemen, our Theater of the Mind now takes an intermission on the Powerhouse Station, 77 WABC, with the Dr. Sky Experience. 1-800-848-9222 for your participation in the theater. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll be going when we come back to John in the volunteer state of Tennessee and you at 1-800-848-9222. We're going to the snack bar and we'll be right back.
The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Dr. Sky Experience.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Exploration is really the essence of the human spirit. As we talk about space journeys here with our very special guest, Tom Harris, that quote from Frank Borman, one of the members of the original crew of Apollo 8 back in 1968, ladies and gentlemen, if you're old enough, as we talk about this particular subject, as we honor the Artemis 2 mission, which is now moved into the month of March. Your questions and comments at 1-800-848-9222. Tom, this is interesting. Let's move on to that very subject. You're a writer for a number of publications over the years, America Out Loud. And you're proud to announce this article, which I think is very apropos as we talk about exploration. After 54 years, America heads back to the moon and beyond. Give us more of the details of this so our listeners know exactly what's happening with NASA.
Yeah, for sure. They want to establish a base on the moon because we have to get used to living in space and on a permanent basis before we attempt the trip to Mars. Now, one of the things that people don't realize is that the trip to the moon is relatively close, although it is 1,000 times further away than the International Space Station. So we're kind of dipping our toes in true exploration when we establish a colony on the moon. Some people say that we should go to Mars pronto and forget about the moon, but I think that would be much too risky. You know, you think about it, if we're in orbit on the International Space Station, we can resupply people very easily. If they get appendicitis or something, we can bring them back quickly. Even on the moon, they're only 3 days away. But Mars, okay, here's the trajectory for a trip to Mars. And people have got to understand the order of magnitude here because otherwise they might think that we can be on Mars like Elon Musk says in the next 10 years, which I don't think is even remotely possible. It takes about 7 or 8 months to drift to Mars, because most of the way there you're just drifting. Once you get there, you have to spend well over a year before the planets are lined up again, and then you've got another 7 or 8 month journey back to the Earth. So you're talking about a 3-year trip. And when you're on Mars, nobody's going to rescue you. Okay, if you get appendicitis or, God forbid, a kidney stone. Now, this is interesting. They're finding that under 0G, they actually get kidney stones more easily than on Earth. And, you know, a kidney stone can kill you. I mean, if it blocks you up totally. So,
it's definitely a painful thing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. So the trip to Mars is much, much, much more difficult. And the analogy I heard from Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut who was he was the commander of the International Space Station. He said, okay, it's like you've been paddling in your canoe around the year 1600 around Paris in the Seine River, and you've gone on a few little trips, a few miles up and down the river, and you suddenly announce, well, I can do that. So now I'm going to go to Australia. He said it's ridiculous because the Mars trip it's another 1,000 times further away than the moon when you actually look at the actual flight path. So it's much more difficult.
Right, either way.
Yeah, and we have to have much longer time between failure for components because you're not going to get any spare parts from Earth, that's for sure. And the psychological impact of living on Mars, oh my God. You've heard of Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer?
Yes.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Red Mars. I have it right here on my shelf. It's part of a trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, as we terraform Mars to become more like the Earth so we don't need spacesuits. And I'll tell you, the big barrier on Red Mars when they first go to Mars is psychological. I mean,
you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, living in that kind of barren environment inside a tin can for years, like, people go crazy. You know, and you know, it's interesting. The astronauts are pretty unusual people. One of the ways they test them for claustrophobia, for example, is they have a canvas ball with a zipper in it. It's about 3 feet across, and they have to crawl in, and they're in the fetal position inside this ball. It's opaque. There's no light through it. And they have oxygen, and they're measuring their heart rate. And they test them to see how long it is before they panic. And, of course, most people would panic in a very short period of time. But the book I was reading from one of the space shuttle astronauts, he had no problem with claustrophobia. So when they put him in the ball, he went to sleep. And they'd wake him up, and they say, hey, this is a test. We're testing you for claustrophobia. He said, yeah, okay. And then he'd go back to sleep. So, I mean, these are very, very special people.
You're indeed right. And let's go back to World War II. We had a few guests here about a couple of weeks ago talking about the great B-17 bombers. The guy or the person in the ball turret, that's a very similar experience.
Oh, yeah.
I was asked to go in that ball turret, flying on a few of those B-17s over the years. You ain't getting me in there, Tom. No, thank you.
So these are really special people, you know, like I have a huge admiration for them. I mean, I was in the Air Force and I flew in jet fighters as the engineer. And there were times when I felt a bit claustrophobic. But being in a spacecraft, my goodness, psychologically, the trip to Mars is going to be torture for the average person. And even for an astronaut, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Well, our contact here with Tom Harris continues, ladies and gentlemen. We call it Theater of the Mind, the Dr. Sky Experience. Your participation, welcome at 1-800-848-9222. But let's continue down the line here and talk about this particular rocket. Many people may not know that NASA's budget is a mere $24.4 billion for this fiscal year 2026. Some may say, wow, that's a lot of money. But in all due respect to all the other agencies here, it's really not a drop in the bucket, but it's quite minuscule, and you got to give them a lot of credit. They're doing as much as I think they can with what they have. But here comes the criticism, if there is any, and I want your comment on this. Maybe not a specific focus in one direction all over the place in many people's estimations. And this SLS rocket, we wish them well, 4 well-trained astronauts headed to the moon, around the moon, to come back on a 10-day journey. But the reality of the situation is, would you not think, Tom, that this is a little late in the game compared to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and the things they've done with great success? And your comment, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. When they landed on the moon, Vice President Agnew said, why wait? We can be on Mars in 88. And, you know, it's interesting because we really were pretty naive as to what we thought was possible. And, you know, they pulled back from the moon exploration, but we could have probably been on Mars by now if we had really focused on it. But for a long, long time, you know, we didn't have the funding. We didn't have the national will, the political will to do it. But that seems to be coming back. And part of the reason it's coming back is because China has announced they're going to have people on the moon pretty soon, too. So in a way, there's a bit of a space race, which, of course, was what drove the original space race to a large extent.
Correct.
Because we wanted to demonstrate to the world that capitalism was a better system, freedom was a better system than the dictatorships. And we succeeded, and we won that war, and it was really worthwhile. But, you know, Dr. Sky, it's interesting because many of the people, and I've met a number of the Apollo astronauts that have walked on the moon. Some are still alive, actually. Harrison Schmitt, for example, from Apollo 17. Exactly. And, you know, these people were not driven in the same way. I mean, they looked at this as a expansion of humankind off the planet. Okay, now, one thing I will say about Elon Musk is his goal of making humanity an interplanetary species is, of course, the right goal. Because, you know, as our technology advances, as more and more nations have nuclear weapons, you know, and various other problems could, in fact, destroy our civilization. And the point that the anthropologist Charles Laughlin makes, he said, look, there is a limited window of opportunity during which time we have the resources, we have the technology, we have the will to expand off planet. If we wait too long, we may lose one of those. And
Absolutely.
so I think that, in fact, NASA's doing the right thing. Yeah, I know there's various people who say that we should just go right on to Mars, but I think that's way too dangerous at this point. The astronaut Hadfield that I mentioned earlier, he says, sure, we can get to Mars in 10 years, but they'd all be dead.
Well, let's do it this way, Tom, and to the vast audience
ready.
let's go to the vast audience here of 77 WABC and throw this question out. Ladies and gentlemen, do you believe that we should be going back to the moon? Your opinions on the space race, if there is one, and this costly, effort, and should it be privatized more so than NASA, because they seem to have more of the success rate? That and your questions and more comment, ladies and gentlemen, at 1-800-848-9222. But, Tom, before we go to the break here in about 2 minutes, I just wanted to throw this out to the audience. This SLS rocket, it has an incredible 8.8 million pounds of thrust. Saturn V had 7.5 million pounds, as you probably know. So it's more, it can lift more weight into low Earth orbit, and then, of course, moving out to the stars, in this case, a trip around the moon. But look at this, from Starship, from Elon Musk, 16 million pounds of thrust with his Raptor engines. That, to me, is more like sci-fi. And we wish them, we're not knocking NASA, we wish them well in this pursuit. But the interesting thing, as you brought up before, the two main rocket motors on the side are these ones you can't shut off. These are the side boosters, and they're actually using 4 of the old shuttle engines that have been modified, these RS-25. So they're using not a whole lot of new engine technology, correct here, and concept. It's a little bit different from the old school.
Yeah, that's for sure. It is interesting, though. Musk is still involved with the Orion project because they're going to be designing the actual lander that, disconnects from the Orion spacecraft. By the way, the Orion spacecraft, if you're ever in Florida, it's really worth seeing because they have, actual physical models of it right there, full-size models. It's like a big Apollo spacecraft because it's going to...
It sure is on steroids. And with that, Tom, we go to our next break here, ladies and gentlemen, as we call it, an opportunity to go to an intermission on a Theater of the Mind program we call the Dr. Sky Experience. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, we see your calls coming in from all over, out of the country, and here in the great United States of America. Participate with us as you'd like. 1-800-848-9222. We will be right back.
The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Dr. Sky Experience.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
In wisdom gathered over time, I have found that every experience is a form of exploration. Stated by the great photographer and environmentalist Ansel Adams. 46 minutes after the hour, we continue with our special guest for this particular hour and hour number 2. Tom Harris, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we go to the callers. We say good morning to Robert in Canada. There you go. Good morning, Robert. You're on with our special guest, Tom Harris. How are you this morning up in Canada?
Oh, I'm great. You woke me up with this Dr. Joseph Hickey report because I'm very skeptical about all this EV business, and we're having a big discussion here in Canada about going to EVs and reducing our supposed carbon footprint and emission in the world as if we're polluting the entire world. And the fact of the matter is Canada is only responsible for about 1.7% of the global emissions, and we're acting as if we were going to save the planet. Now, the thing about EVs is they were talking about the poster child for EVs, which is China, and, for their production and use of EVs, yet they burn coal to produce the electricity which runs those EVs. Now, I think personally that electricity is very important. However, here in Quebec, about 2 weeks ago, in Montreal, we had a very serious power failure, and thousands of homes were left without power in those freezing temperatures.
Wow, what a shame.
For days, between 4 and 7, and in some cases 8 days. Pipes broke. There was tremendous damage. And all I can say is that in 1998, you may recall, we had the ice storm, And there was a possibility that we would have to evacuate Montreal because of the breakdown of our water system. And you can imagine, if we only had EVs and people were trying to get out of a city, which is an island, and the EVs started breaking down, people couldn't get out. There would be panic and pandemonium.
Well, Robert, in Montreal, you bring up a lot to discuss here. Tom, he brings up some amazing points about this subject. Please continue, Tom Harris.
Well, right. In fact, our current prime minister is pushing electric vehicles like crazy, and it's a huge mistake. I mean, the bottom line is they don't work very well in cold temperatures. They're very risky to power failures. You get a power failure, you got no electricity to run your car. I'm sure when people are evacuating because a hurricane is coming, they're very glad that they have a full tank of gasoline. But, the other point that was raised recently by our Premier here in Ontario, and hello to another Canadian in Quebec. I grew up in Montreal. Is that they're finding in more of the electronics in the so-called green energy field, that the Chinese Communist Party are insisting that they put in spy devices so that they can actually turn off our electric vehicles or turn off our various battery energy storage systems or wind turbines. They can turn them off from Beijing. And, it's interesting because our premier was bringing up this point that these Chinese vehicles that are being allowed now into Canada are very likely infected with these devices, and that they may not allow them to cross into the United States because of security concerns. So this is a huge mistake. Allowing these EVs in from China, massive mistake.
Robert in Montreal, thank you for joining us. We move on with other callers here. Let's say good morning to Edgar. You've been patient in the Bronx. Good morning. You're on with Tom Harris. Thanks for joining the show. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Just to be quick, I foresee that in time that the human race on planet Earth will somehow colonize the different, certain moons, maybe, I don't know about planets, but certain moons in the solar system. Like around Jupiter, but life will continue. Human life will make it. For the moon, for example, I see colonies on the moon in the future. People being born on the moon, and they have their own identity and all that. So I foresee all of that. I have two questions, if I may, very quickly.
Go ahead, sir.
Go
ahead, Edgar.
Yes, thank you. The cause of the ice ages on the planet Earth was caused supposedly by some aspect of its orbit is like orbit related around the sun. If I could get an explanation on that. And number two, I read some article where it says the passage of time on Mars is different from the passage of time on the Earth.
Yes, it is. It sure is. Edgar, let's have Tom respond to these, and just quickly, just to interject here before we lose the hour. Yes, you're talking about days, minutes length, more like 39 minutes or so longer on the Martian surface. They call them sols, S-O-Ls. But Tom, continue on, because I think Edgar brings up some very good points. His positivity of moving out the humans to the stars.
Oh, I agree. I think that we will become a spacefaring society. And in fact, I can see the day when there'll be more humans living off Earth than on, and, you talk about Mars. As you said, it's approximately the same length day as the Earth. It's pretty close, but it's got a year that's about twice as long. The sun at the surface of Mars is about 2.5 times less than the sun at the surface of Earth, which is why we're going to need nuclear reactors when we actually live there. And in fact, talking about the ice ages, those are driven by what are called Milankovitch cycles. And there are three major Milankovitch cycles. One's the shape of the Earth's orbit, which is called eccentricity, and that has a huge period of 100,000 years. And the next one is axial tilt, how much the Earth's axis tilts from the vertical. And, it varies on a period of 41,000 years. Currently, it's, it tilts between 21 and 24 degrees. And the other one is that our axis wobbles. Okay, if you have a top, if you have a top and you're spinning it, as it slows down before it comes to a stop, it starts to wobble. That period is about 26,000 years. And those Milankovitch cycles are what are driving the very long-term ins and outs of glacial periods and ice ages.
Well, Edgar, thank you. Time doesn't permit us to do too much more with conversation, but we really appreciate you and your insightful comments about the positivity of moving on to the planets and then on to the stars. That's the main theme that we're talking about for hour one. We'll continue, of course, in hour number two with the regular topics that Tom Harris brings to the table about the climate science issues that are perplexing many people out there. And also, let's do this right now, just to let everybody know the current weather on the surface of Mars. The Perseverance rover, now in day Sol, which they call a day 4,799, as of February 5th. This is the latest temperature recording. The high temperature, Tom, and audience, was 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Think of that. Pretty warm for Mars. But
nice.
Don't be too confident for the nighttime temperature, because the low at that night or that early morning, minus 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Rather inhospitable unless you had warm socks and an electric blanket or some kind of electric clothing. What say you?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's a bigger range even than the panhandle of Texas, which can have 100 degrees Celsius, 100 degree Fahrenheit range, over the course of a year. But, Mars is going to be a rough place to live, but it's going to be something that we should do. We really should do it. And I say that not just because of the technological benefits and things like that, but I say because humans have evolved to be an exploring animal. And if you have a look at the history of our species, you can see that it is a critical part of what it means to be fully human. And if you take that away, according to various social scientists, it will be very dangerous to our society. In fact, here's a quote from University of Hawaii anthropologist. He says that a withdrawal from exploration and development of space would put the brakes on our cultural and intellectual advancement. Okay, and I can really believe that, because throughout history, societies that explored were more dynamic and they had more of a tolerance of alternative ideas because they were coming in so quickly they couldn't control it. The country, and it's interesting, when the Confucians took over China, they stopped the exploration that had been going on. I mean, if it had continued, they would have discovered Europe. They were almost there. They're almost around the southern tip of Africa.
And they're sure aggressive right now in their military and space program about moving around the planet, you bet, in conquering and taking over different areas of real estate, as we call it. Right. That's interesting.
But the interesting thing is they wanted to control the population. They did not like the influx of new ideas and new things, like when they brought a giraffe back to China. I mean, this was wild, and they didn't like that instability. They wanted to control it, so they burned all the ships that were capable of significant ocean-going voyages, and they made it a capital offense for a captain to sail a ship with three sails, which was, of course, needed for these long trips. Yes. So they withdrew. They withdrew from exploration, and then they were discovered by the Europeans, and, of course, that was terrible for their society.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, plenty of time to get in on the conversation. We're talking about the need for the space program in both of our opinions and your opinion on such a subject, and also about the climate crisis. What say you, our special guest, as we move into hour number 2, Tom Harris, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. His website, we encourage you to check it out, is icsc-canada.com. And an interesting story before we close out this hour, a white paper coming out by some rather interesting, prestigious locations around the world in the medical field are giving a caution to the wind. There is no wind in space other than the solar wind of this, Tom Harris. Be careful, they're saying, about procreation in space and the birth of babies in space due to some very serious concerns about developing those children in space environments when they're that young. That's an interesting story, too. What say you?
Well, that's Ben Bova wrote a science fiction story about a colony on the moon, and when they sent a representative to Earth, he had to wear an exoskeleton because his body had evolved in 1/6 gravity on the moon, so he simply couldn't stand up on the Earth. In fact, his heart wouldn't even be strong enough to function. So, if you have colonists that are born in space, or on a very low-gravity planet, they're going to be very, very different to us, and they may never be able to come back to Earth. So this is a very significant factor. Larry Niven writes about this all the time, and he does really interesting stories about humans that are born and brought up in radically different environments. And the conclusion that Ben Finney has, the anthropologist, he says the first extraterrestrials we meet will not be true aliens, but they'll be descendants from humans that have changed so much because of not only genetic engineering, but also massively different environments that we won't even recognize them as our cousins.
Tom, I believe that wholeheartedly, and I put this theory out there, and I should probably write a book, but I'm sure somebody's beaten us to it, and maybe you too, to do the same thing, that these extraterrestrial entities that people are seeing, these Tic Tacs and all these other manifestations of what we call unidentified flying objects, may indeed be, ladies and gentlemen, hear this out, and I would love your comment on this, that in the future, if we could have the ability to warp space-time, okay, the curvature of space, let's say the human, which obviously went back and came from caves, and all of a sudden the world, was destroyed. Where do humans go? They hide out back in caves with AI taking over, and there becomes this intercession, I don't know how, just a theory, sci-fi wise, that humans and AI meld together, the bio of us and that of AI, and AI knows how to do the warpage of space, and it can move through space-time, and you're right, maybe those aliens are us in the future.
Yeah.
What say you
maybe.
In about 30 seconds?
Yeah, maybe so. And in fact, it's interesting that Charles Laughlin, the anthropologist, says that the next phase in human evolution will be cyborgization. When we start to incorporate into our bodies more and more artificial things, eventually having the whole Encyclopedia Britannica in a chip the size of a salt crystal that you can just stick under your skin. And the interesting thing then is that what defines us as human? Are we still human at all?
And those questions, hopefully with you, ladies and gentlemen, as hour number 2 begins right after the top of the hour at 1-800-848-9222. And our Theater of the Mind encourages you to take this intermission and maybe go to the snack bar and join us back for hour number 2. We will be right back.
The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome to hour number 2, ladies and gentlemen, of the Dr. Sky Experience, a theater of the mind kind of show, with your participation at 1-800-848-9222. Tonight's adventure, we dig deep into the climate crisis, as many people describe it, and other subjects of interest with our very special guest. We call him a friend of the show, and likewise back to us, too. Tom Harris, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. His website, icsc-canada.com. And ladies and gentlemen, we talk about, if you're a first-time listener, we appreciate you. And to all the regular listeners, we talk about the subjects of astronomy, space, aviation, weather, celebrity guests, and stories of American exceptionalism. And many thanks to our helmsmen, Tony and Bill, that now navigate that powerhouse, this powerhouse blowtorch signal of 77 WABC. Tom, welcome back. So much to talk about. I wanted to shift the gears, if you don't mind, into this particular subject. Right now on the sun, I've been a solar observer with the special solar telescopes for years, going way back to the dangerous days when you put it on a projection screen. Why do I mention that? Ladies and gentlemen, something amazing is happening right now. One of the largest sunspot groups of entire solar cycle 25 is literally on the face of the sun. To see it safely, simply go to spaceweather.com, the big orange ball there. That massive sunspot group is the distance between Earth and the moon. The journey that these Apollo astronauts, the Artemis 2 astronauts will take. I keep thinking of Apollo. That is massive. 8 large X-flares, over this last week, and maybe more to come. So let's talk a little bit about that. The sun itself, you've written an article here just as recent as January in America Out Loud, and it's titled what? It's the Sun, Stupid, a dive into real climate science with Dr. Willie Soon. What's that all about? Talk to us about it.
Yeah, for sure. He shows that when you look at the rural temperature in the United States, not the city, because the city temperatures are affected by what's called the urban heat island, and, that would be things like cutting down a forest and putting up a parking lot, retains the heat, of course. But if you actually look at rural temperatures and you compare it with the total solar irradiance, which is the output from the sun, they match almost perfectly for 120 years. That's what he shows in this little video. That, in fact, it's the sun that is driving climate change. And, of course, the sun then makes clouds. It's directly responsible for clouds. And so that is, in fact, much more significant than anything that we're doing. So, we're in, as you said, a very active period right now. We're just near or past the peak of solar cycle 25.
Correct. And
we're seeing lots of very active sunspots. The sun is moderately active right now. It has one very strong region. And this, they say, is, in fact, more significant than anything that we're doing.
Most definitely, Tom. That's incredible. And for those out there that are interested, don't stare directly at it, obviously, without solar protection for the eye against the bright light of the sun, naturally. But it's interesting, this big fusion ball around the equator, it rotates, obviously, around 25 Earth days. And as you get closer to the poles, it takes some 33 days. But why do I mention this? Because all of this particular energy, can you imagine if we could harness the power of fusion? That would be literally just what? Astronomical. It's more like a sci-fi thing. But they are working on projects like this around the world to harness and create fusion power. Now, that would change the whole dynamic of everything in the oil and gas industry, without a doubt. Talk about fusion. Yeah. That's amazing.
Well, of course, yeah, fusion is different to fission. I mean, the first atomic bomb was fission, breaking the atom and releasing huge amounts of energy. But the sun works in a different way. It takes hydrogen atoms and it fuses them together to make helium and then eventually other heavier elements, and that's called hydrogen fusion. And the idea is that they would like to be able to do that on the Earth, because when you fuse together the different hydrogen atoms, you end up with a massive release of energy and essentially no pollution. Okay, this is the wonderful thing about it. So if we can someday develop hydrogen fusion and run our reactors that way, wow, we'll have energy forever, literally.
Well, in your opinion, and I want to hear this, so the audience, I'm sure, would be asking this question, and ladies and gentlemen, your opportunity at 1-800-848-9222. Of all these alternate sources of energy right now, which one is still in the lead position and which one is not? I want to hear it from you. You study climate science.
Yeah, well, across the world, the lead energy source for electricity is coal. Okay, that is, in fact, a major energy source, and if you burn it cleanly, it's a wonderful energy source. In fact, China, as one of the callers said, they're building their wind turbines using coal. That's the electricity source. And, of course, developing countries, India as well, they're massively expanding their coal use. So coal is a great source of energy. Oil is used, of course, for transportation. And in some places, like Saudi Arabia, they actually use it for generating electricity and stationary power plants. But that's the ideal source for actually moving, vehicles and things like that, at least at the current stage. Natural gas, it's been a wonderful source as well. The only thing is, natural gas is also used for pharmaceuticals and other material processing as well. So we really don't want to burn it all. If we can use coal in place of natural gas and we do it cleanly, that's better because we actually save the natural gas for other things. It's interesting when they say we're going to replace coal with natural gas. Well, that's kind of like a reverse Midas touch. You're turning gold into lead. Mm-hmm. Like, why would we want to use natural gas, which is a very special fuel? It has a lot of benefits besides just using in stationary power plants. Why would we want to waste it on stationary power plants? We should use coal and nuclear for that mainly, and save natural gas. As I say, it's kind of a reverse Midas touch, using natural gas for base load power.
Talk about windmills and the generation of wind power. It's taken a lot of hits, and I think many people have a right to this, their opinion on this. Everybody has a right to their opinion. But the wind power situation, talk about this, because I've read, and we keep hearing this all over the place, that wind power, it's bad for the birds. Many times they get in the way of the wind, the turbines and the blades. What's the status of wind power now, as far as an alternate source of energy?
Yeah, wind power has expanded hugely across the world. There's, I don't know exactly the number, but it's something like 250,000 wind turbines, large industrial wind turbines around the world. And the problem with wind turbines is they're weather dependent. Okay, they vary based on the wind. If the wind is too slow, they don't turn. If the wind is too fast, they actually have to feather the blades because it'll break them. So whenever you build a wind turbine, you're really building a natural gas station because you need to have the backup for when the wind turbine isn't working. And, that's exactly what Robert Kennedy said, Robert Kennedy Jr., when he was advocating against wind turbines. He said, look, you build a wind turbine, you're also building a natural gas power plant because you need to have a power plant that can respond really quickly to very fast changes in the wind. And if you don't have that backup, you get what happened in Texas in 2021. When Winter Storm Uri hit, they had almost 50% of their power coming from wind just before the storm, but the wind died, and the other power sources were not able to take up the slack, and up to 700 people died. Now, the media went out of their way to say that this was not caused by wind turbines, but it really was. I mean, that was the major cause. And, if you look, it's funny, CNBC, they actually had on a sign behind the announcer, written on the screen, this blackout was not caused by wind turbines. So they did their best to defend them. But if you actually look at the power output versus time, you can see exactly what happened. The wind died. The other systems were not able to take up the slack, and up to 700 people died because it was colder in Texas at that time than it was in Alaska. It was a similar weather pattern to what we're experiencing now, but much worse.
Let's get to the nitty-gritty on this one. This one, I'm sure, affects every single listener out there, or it should. Is climate science hijacked by incomplete data? We covered some of this in your opinion. And how is this going to affect your finances in 2026? But let me zoom in more specifically, Tom Harris, on the situation of electric generation and electric power. We here in Arizona see our rates go up. The big, issue that was back in the gubernatorial campaign in New Jersey was that, as in many other states, the ridiculous pricing and increase in prices of electricity. So talk about this across the country. I'm fascinated to hear about this. Some allege that these data centers are now taking up so much water and power. That's a reason that everything is going up. I don't know what's really true, what's fact or fiction. Talk about this whole energy crisis with electric power.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of factors. One of them is that there's more demand because of these data centers, no question about it. In fact, some of the companies that run these data centers are buying old nuclear reactors. They're getting 3 Mile Island going again because specifically they want to be able to power the data centers. The other trouble is, of course, they're pushing more and more wind and solar power. And I'll give you an example of what happens when you replace coal, let's say, which is a good, solid, dependable energy source, with wind power. In the province I live in Ontario, in around 2001, we were getting 25% of our electricity from coal, and we had one of the cheapest electricity rates in the world, actually. But our premier at that time said he was going to get rid of coal, and sure enough, they did, and now it's zero. From coal, and we have hundreds and hundreds of these wind turbines taller than the Statue of Liberty, and the price of electricity depends on the time period, but it's varied from double to triple what it was back in that time frame. So, yeah, you bring in a lot of wind and solar, and you pay a great deal more. You see the places in Europe that have the most wind and solar power, like Germany, also have the highest electricity rates, and that's because not only are these sources unreliable and expensive, but you have to build doubly. You have to build the backup station as well. And it's interesting, Dr. Sky, if you have a natural gas fired power plant, in the background, it has to ramp up and down and up and down and up and down to compensate for the variable output of the wind. So your efficiency of your gas plant becomes a lot less than if you just simply ran it as the primary energy source and kept it at a consistent rate. It's kind of like driving your car. If you drove at 1 mile an hour, 10 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, you get terrible gas mileage. So the bottom line is, instead of building wind turbines and having to have a backup natural gas station, just build the gas station.
I hear you, my friend. I'd like to hear from the listeners out there on the concern and question. How badly has your electric rates been affected here, and why? I mean, in states like New Jersey, not to be repetitive, the gubernatorial election that just happened this past year, in New Jersey specifically, one of the big issues on this particular, campaign trail for who the new governor would be is all about high electric rates. And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen out there, you may be experiencing that. Is it because, as Tom and I are saying, maybe these, big AI, powered data centers are taking up all the electric? Who knows? 1-800-848-9222 might be a way to get some conversation going on that particular subject. But it is interesting. I mean, how does all this happen? I mean, the local counties and cities, they have these board of the commissioners. They sit there and they go ahead and they just decide to vote on this stuff. And many times the people are not even invited to hear the conversation, right? It just happens overnight. This is what I'm hearing. Yeah,
exactly. And the wind turbines are being supported by the media. In Canada, for example, there's a really interesting circumstance where, it turns out with all the subsidies that are given to media, they did it in response to the COVID lockdowns. They wanted to help these media companies stay in business. It turns out that now up to 50% of the salary of every journalist in every newsroom across Canada is paid by the government.
Oh, wow.
So good luck trying to get, kind of unbiased reporting.
Mm-hmm.
See, the trouble is most of the people that write in the media in support of wind and solar power, they have no engineering background. They don't understand things like capacity factor and the intermittency problem of wind and solar. You only get power when wind blows, and you only get power from the solar when it's sunny, and you don't get it in the winter because it's covered with snow. They're very unrealistic. I find that our city here in Ottawa, they think they're going to be able to someday power the whole city with wind and solar power. Well, that to me is a recipe to go and live somewhere else.
It sure can be, and it sure is. Here in Arizona, we had just recently a whole thing coming up, a big debate on whether in X location a new data center should be built. But because of the public outcry and the people testifying about the reason they didn't want it, in this particular case, they succeeded. So what's your word, Tom, in the special, message that you can deliver here, talking about climate crisis, and things that may not be true that people are hearing out there? What say you about how they can become an activist of their own in trying to see that some of these things are we hear the truth. We don't want to hear the lies. What do you suggest people do to stay active, to fight for your rights?
Well, I think there's a few things. It's difficult because the media censors so much. That article that I had published in American Thinker, the reason I went to American Thinker was because I couldn't get it published in Canada. I went to all the top conservative outlets, the leading ones, and they wouldn't take it. And they had all kinds of excuses. Oh, well, this hasn't been reviewed in the peer-reviewed literature sufficiently. But when, as I said earlier, when they actually have a report or a study that supports the climate change narrative, they publish it immediately. Okay, it's all over the newspaper. So it's very difficult for the average person to even get a letter to the editor in because there's so much censorship. So what they can do is call into talk radio. I mean, that is a really good thing.
Amen. That's what we're doing. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The most powerful thing to prevent censorship is what? Not only talk radio, but people, speaking out in good ways. And what's the bad way? Don't burn the building down and start revolting, and that's not going to solve a problem. But you're right. Talk radio has been the traditional way for people to voice their opinion, and it spreads like wildfire.
Yes, exactly. And people should call out at the beginning of a show, because what happens, I find, is if you call in early in the show, then other people in the audience hear it and say, yeah, that's what I was thinking. And next thing you know, they're calling in too. So, sometimes people will say, I'm kind of shy. I want to wait till later in the show and see what other people say. No, you should call in right away at the beginning of the show. Get online as soon as you can. Unless you're swearing, generally speaking, you're not going to be censored out, and you get to say what you want to say. And
you bring up good points. Right.
Yeah,
and that number, 1-800-848-9222, to do exactly what Tom is saying. It's never late, because we have the time here to listen, ladies and gentlemen, in this particular conversation. And if you're just joining us from around the nation, around the world, Tom Harris, he's the executive director of the Ottawa, Canada-based International Climate Science Coalition. How long have you been involved in this, so the audience knows? I mean, this is not something you started a week ago, and I said that being very positive to you. How long have you been doing this?
Well, in 1999, I wrote an article for the Ottawa Citizen in which I said, exploring the planet, it gives us information that helps us, save the Earth. And I gave an example of a runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. And a local professor, who doesn't want me to use his name because, it's dangerous in the academic world to disagree with the climate scare, he actually used my article in his class. He thought it was really good. He said, however, this part that says that if we continue to increase CO2, we're going to have Venus-like conditions on Earth, he said that's not possible. And he gave all kinds of reasons that we could talk about later. One of them is that we have oceans on the Earth that absorb CO2, and we have plate tectonics that pull it down into the Earth's mantle at the bottom of the ocean. None of that happens on Venus. And so he said to the students, this is a good article, comparative planetology, but that part's wrong. And I thought, who is this guy? Right-wing, climate change denier.
Yes.
I was on the other side. And he invited me into his lab, and he showed me the geologic record, which shows no consistent correlation between CO2 levels and temperature. And the thing that blew me away, Dr. Sky, in 1999, which is when I sort of converted, is at 440 million years ago, it was a period when some people think that the whole Earth was covered with ice, including the oceans, iceball Earth theory. And at that time, CO2 was more than 1,000% of today. It was more than 10 times higher than today, and yet we were in the coldest period in the last 500 million years, which is about...
And that's exactly right, Tom. People need to study all these different periods in history when climate changed dramatically, long before the people were here on the Earth. And it's interesting to me, every time I listen to certain weather channels, and you listen to the NOAA weather channel that comes on a specific frequency on certain radios, they always talk about the highs and lows. So sometimes they'll talk about lows going back to like 1900, 1925 for highs, and I'm saying to myself, wasn't this a natural cycle in the Earth? Was it possibly El Nino or La Nina to get involved here? And not necessarily, nor dismissing people who would pollute or do things nefarious to the atmosphere. So obviously this has been going a long time. So Earth's been through what? So many extinction events. But Mother Earth, not to sit back on her laurels, has had the ability to be a most amazing planet to rebound from all of these different things. And Tom, in the few minutes before the hard break here, I just wanted to move on to something that people are texting me on. And they're saying, hey, Dr. Sky, we talk about the sky. That's the whole mantra of the whole show. So we always give them, Tom, a little sky report. So this is interesting, ladies and gentlemen. No matter where you are, the coldest of temperatures or a warmer climate, here, if it's dark out and you have a clear sky, the moon, past its full phase right now, moves on to last quarter on the 9th, rising around midnight. The moon's farthest away from us on the 10th. We call it apogee. And for anybody, maybe penguins particular and whales in the ocean, an annular eclipse of the sun takes place on the 17th. Hardly anybody will see it, but rest assured it will happen. New moon on the 17th, the best time of the month, not only in my opinion, but I'm sure Tom's too, for looking at very faint object. Your planet of the month pretty much is Jupiter, high up into the eastern sky. If you look up there, that big white orb, now over 400 million miles away, then the moon continues to wax the beautiful thin crescent as it starts to be visible by around the 19th, low into the south-southwest. And don't forget, there's something even stranger happening. On the 20th, we'll find out that there's an incredible close conjunction of Saturn, which is visible to the naked eye, high up in the southwest, and those of you with telescopes, less than a degree southeast of Saturn, the very, very distant, now the 8th planet of the solar system, Neptune, is visible as a tiny little blue speck over 2 billion miles away. Interesting stuff, right, Tom, to talk about it?
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, it's going to be really exciting when we finally get to Jupiter and we actually start to explore Europa, which they think has an ocean under the ice. You know, they're talking about Europa Clipper, the mission express to Jupiter. I mean, there's lots of exciting things happening. And I don't know if you realize it, but later this year, we have another spacecraft going into orbit around Mercury. It's called the Bepi Colombo. It's a it's a European Space Agency Japanese mission, and it's going to go into a tight orbit of Mercury. So there's lots of cool things happening this year.
Totally amazing, Tom. The sky is filled with so many wonderful things to see. And that's how we started this a long, long time ago in my own life, reporting on these particular subjects deep into the night. These are the many mysteries of the world, the universe. And we bring Tom Harris here on regular as a guest. Proud to call him a friend of the show. As many of the good emails that we do get here. My email, if you'd like to make guest suggestions or comments, is just drsky@wabcradio.com. And the beat goes on, ladies and gentlemen. So many wonderful things. And again, not to be on a soapbox, but if you're ever coming to Arizona, and I know we seem to be the heat center of the country in Southern California, we do once a month a beautiful dinner cruise. People tell us that. For the last 10 years on a beautiful dinner boat called the Dolly Steamboat on one of the most beautiful lakes in Arizona. The Dolly Steamboat, I'm privileged and honored to be the host of a very interesting tour. We take deep, powerful lasers to move into the deep of the night, a wonderful catered dinner on board, and people from all over the world, mostly East Coast people, Tom, and people from Canada, come, of course, this time of year. They want to see the wonders and splendors of the universe. And to learn much more about that, simply go to dollysteamboat.com. You'll see this most incredible cruising boat that goes on the lake. We take about 100 people on this special cruise into what we call Arizona's Junior Grand Canyon, into the dark of the night. And that, many, many years ago, was formed as what? A man-made lake, by the great conservationist President Theodore Roosevelt. and the waterway of the indigenous people, the Hohokam Nation that lived here and still proudly can claim land here in the desert Southwest. We'll be right back with Tom Harris, and ladies and gentlemen, your calls like Cheryl Lynn in Canada and others at 1-800-848-9222. We will be right back.
The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Dr. Sky Experience.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
With so much conflict in the world, space exploration can become a beacon of hope. So says Anne McLean, maybe the first female astronaut to land on the moon. Only time will tell. 33 minutes after the hour, Tom Harris is our guest to the top of the show, top of hour number 2. And ladies and gentlemen, we now go to callers. They've been patient. We say good morning to our friends to the north in Canada. Good morning. Cheryl Lynn, you're on the Dr. Sky Experience. Thanks for your patience.
Good morning. Here I sit in my over 4 foot of snow.
There you go.
But I love it. I love snow. And it snowed all day long today, too. So anyway, my nephew's going to come over tomorrow and plow for me. The reason I'm calling is all the talk that you hear, whether you're listening to scientist shows or whatever, they talk about how everything's got to be electricity down the road because we've got to get off the gas, we've got to get off this. We had a high-efficiency electric furnace because gas wasn't down the road because I kind of live out in the country. And they finally put a gas line down there, so we hooked up to it and put in a natural gas furnace. Our electricity bills went from $700 a month to less than $200.
Wow.
Wow. Because going all electricity is extremely expensive.
Yeah,
and so it's like they keep talking about how efficient it'll be and how wonderful it won't be. And I don't think people realize that.
Yeah,
you know,
that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. Also, earlier when you're talking about the space thing, I listened to a scientist last week on the radio, and he was talking about all of the satellites, and he gave a large number that go up daily into the atmosphere. And he said they contribute a lot to this global warming thing. And he said the problem is a lot of them say they will dissolve after they're up there, but nobody's checking on them. Nobody knows what they're sending up. Is there any kind of regulation that somebody is watching or anything about all this stuff that gets put up there?
Sherilyn, stay with us. Fascinating comments and questions. Tom, this is amazing, and I appreciate Sherilyn greatly. Your response.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of space junk. It's very dangerous, actually, and becoming more dangerous for having impacts in orbit. You know, you have a bolt going at 20,000 miles an hour relative speed to you. Let's say it's going 3,000 miles an hour and you're going 17. You got a 20,000 mile an hour difference. A bolt will go right through your spacesuit. So a lot of this space junk is certainly very hazardous to the people that are in orbit. Whether it affects climate, I've never heard that before. Quite frankly, I don't know how it would.
Yeah, here's an answer to this too. Yeah, here's an answer to this, Sherilyn, and this is a very important point. They're saying, and again, with the number of satellites that are being launched, an all-time record, whether it's Elon Musk or everybody else up there, in cases where a lot of these deorbit or even rockets up into space, a lot of this particular that comes down once these items burn up in the atmosphere, they increase a lot of this aluminum particulate or metallic substances in the atmosphere. Now, this could be, I'm not a climatologist, but the truth of the matter is it could be adding to changes. And that goes to another great guest that we have here, Tom, like yourself, who talks about geoengineering. So, Sherilyn, there may be something along, the lines of we're changing the dynamics of what's going on in the ionosphere way up into the stratosphere by all these different launches. Sherilyn, you get the last word on this.
Yeah, I just think that, they seem to want to blame the little people, everybody driving cars and everything, but there's a lot of other components to it, and like this gentleman was saying about how you can't get things in certain newspapers and such what.
Sure.
It's true. I mean, they only want to put in there what they're being told to put in, and they don't want to give people compromises as to this is this and this is that, And,
well, Sherilyn, my wish for you is warmth and lower electric bills, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please continue.
Warmth. I'm really a person that loves snow, and I love the cold. When I worked at the hospital, I had a little snowman that was up in my office, and it said, "Let it snow," and I kept it up there year round, even in the summer, because I like the snow. But
yeah, well, you don't get the big insects. That's one thing we don't have, and nobody lives under the bridge. Nobody lives under the bridge in the winter here. They're dead.
There you go. Well, Sherilyn, I love your warmth about the snow and the positivity there, and hopefully we've answered some of the questions and concerns that you have, but thank you. May I ask, where in Canada are you located, if you don't mind me asking?
In Selwyn, Ontario, which is probably 100 miles northeast of Toronto. I live just outside of Peterborough.
Wow. Well, I always loved Toronto when I visited. It was a beautiful place.
Yeah, Sherilyn, you've given me something to research. I hadn't thought about the idea that all these launches are contributing to climate change, especially when they re-enter the atmosphere and break up. I'll research that.
Well, good morning to you, Sherilyn. Warmth and lower electric bills is what we're trying to say, and hope everybody out there who has also additional comments, you can do that, ladies and gentlemen, at 1-800-848-9222. Thank you, Sherilyn, in Canada. Interesting callers, and we seem to get a lot of them from Canada when you're on, of course, and that's apropos. So here's another one before we go to the break. One of your articles that you just had back on January 26th, as you wrote very well, eloquently, I should say here, and I've read this. Let's not follow California into energy poverty. Define that to those that may not understand what that really means behind the scenes.
Well, that's right. And in fact, it turns out that in California, this is one of the most developed part of the world. They're actually having major problems with energy poverty. That in fact a high fraction of the population cannot afford their energy bills. I just wanted to give you a couple of quotes here.
Please.
It says in excess of 1 in 4 Southern Californians can't pay their energy bills at all, according to an ABC7 analysis of the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey data. Okay, I'll say that again. That means over 8 million Californians are living with energy debt. Okay, and this is largely because the rates have gone so high because the state has gotten rid of their least expensive energy sources, and they're trying to run the state with these flimsy wind and solar power sources. So, it's a very serious problem in California. You'd think of all places in the world, California wouldn't have any people in energy poverty, but they do. And in fact, Jason Isaac was our guest on the show back a couple of weeks ago, and he said this: since 2022, electricity costs in California has risen nearly 35%, 3 times the rate of overall inflation. Okay, families did not suddenly become irresponsible. Their bills simply became unaffordable.
That's really tragic. And imagine, not just there in California, look at other people around the country. What if you're on a fixed income like Social Security and you're barely able to go to the grocery store, God help you, and now all of a sudden there's obstreperous rate in your increase in energy? What are you supposed to do? And let's say a family in a home, they're having their mortgage paid. What the heck's the sense of having a mortgage and a home if you have no power and no electricity or anything like that? It's very sad.
Well, right. And we've got a preview of what's coming if this continues with the excessive focus on wind and solar. Look at England. England, they have a circumstance, they call it eat or heat, for seniors and people on fixed incomes. And in fact, in England, it's always cold, because they always keep the temperature down low. But they actually have a very serious problem there where citizens, seniors especially, they're finding them dead in their apartments because they don't have enough heat. So,
well, Tom, we've been hearing that from the WABC audience here. People have been emailing me, and it's very interesting about the problematic thing of no heat in their homes, apartments, and places like that. And that's just horrible. I cannot imagine with the cold temperatures that people are experiencing. That is something very, very serious and hopefully can be resolved in a very quick way. To say the least.
For sure.
Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, this is a real serious threat. People that don't have power when it's minus 20, in northeast. It was amazing. Wind chills of minus 20 in northwest Arkansas just in the past week. And 15,000 people had no power. That is deadly. That is really
that's
deadly.
Horrible. Well, like here in Arizona during the heat of this summer, a lot of places have opened up these cooling stations and hydration places, of course. On the opposite side, when you're burning to the point where, you could lose your life because of heat stroke, the same thing hopefully can be done for instances where people are suffering. I don't know what the answer is. I'm not a political guy, but the truth of the matter is it's a good thing for the listeners to hear, and maybe by action, maybe things can be done. Tom, before we go to the break, I want to mention you also do a podcast. Do I have this correctly? It's The Other Side of the Story. Is that the correct podcast?
That's right. We try to bring in people who say things that are not politically correct, but are sensible people. Things about climate change, things about all sorts of things. And, it's really fun because they can't get media coverage, but we give it to them. So people log into AmericaOutloudNews.net and, AmericaOutloud.news. That's the site, AmericaOutloud.news. And click on the other side of the story. And we bring in lots of leading experts who are saying things you're not going to hear in mainstream media.
Tom, simply, not to sound ridiculous and ridiculous to the listeners out there, have we lost the art of debate in this world today? I mean, I remember in high school we had debate class. In college we had debate. What say you? And how do we resurrect that so critical thinking becomes the law of the land with common sense?
Yeah, I think that what's needed in schools in particular is that they get back to that. They get back to having debates. We had IODE competitions, and people would be given the job of defending or opposing a certain point of view, and they didn't have a choice. So they actually had to research something perhaps which would be different to what they had heard in other places. And I think we just need a lot more respect and humility in recognizing that the more you learn about these issues, the more you realize how complicated they are, and that the simple answers that are portrayed by the media often don't make any sense at all. So, I think people have to be more humble, more respectful of other points of view, and recognize that, if you learn more, you might change your opinion.
With common sense, and don't fall prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Things are more complicated than they appear on the surface.
Tom Harris, we're coming up on the last break of the 2-hour show here. And ladies and gentlemen, we haven't gotten to you. We will. We have, when we return, Tony in Arizona and hopefully others at 1-800-848-9222 on the Dr. Sky Experience. As we now say in the Theater of the Mind, we take an intermission. So now it's time for many to go to the snack bar, or don't change that dial. We'll be right back.
The Dr. Sky Experience on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Dr. Sky Experience.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
That is the exploration that awaits you. Not mapping the stars and studying nebulae, but charting the unknown possibilities of existence. A quote from Mr. Spock, the late, great Leonard Nimoy. 46 minutes after the hour, we race to the top of hour number 2, as we call it, moving through time and space in Theater of the Mind. Well, Tom, let's go to Arizona and welcome a listener out there. And Tony, good morning. You're on the radio show, The Dr. Sky Experience. Thanks for being up with us. Your question or comment?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sky and Mr. Harris. You were talking about the climate change, things like that. Also, energy demands and things that are needed, always being looked for. Right now, I want to ask something that is a constant, in our world, our atmosphere, and that's the gas nitrogen. And what's the most important thing that we benefit from with the nitrogen gas, and how is it used commercially? How do we somewhat exploit nitrogen to use in our favor? And I'll take the answer off the air.
Well, the main thing is the use of the Haber-Bosch process to produce nitrogen fertilizers. Right now, half of the world's population is able to eat because of nitrogen fertilizers. Okay, so that is the major ingredient, I think, that nitrogen provides us. It's a fertilizer, and of course, it's essential for plant growth, and that's what we need it for sure.
Yes, it's interesting too. Tom, I notice if a lot of the companies here in the West and maybe all over the country, when you get a new set of tires, a lot of times the inflation is done with nitrogen. Now, I don't know if that's just a sales pitch thing. I have no idea. But I asked the person who, put that in there, and I said, what's the benefit? And he said, well, when you're rolling down the road, it apparently has the ability when you're running in a hot environment like we have, it's better for the tire. So I don't know. There's another thing used for nitrogen. It's in putting in tires. I'm sure you've heard that, right?
Well, it's inert, too, so it's not going to react to cause the tire to degrade. It's interesting for my trailer, which I bought a little while ago, it had nitrogen in, and actually the interesting thing is I've never had to fill the tires in 5 years. So I don't know if that's the reason because of the nitrogen in there, but that's certainly one of the uses. But most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So
absolutely. Good point that Tony brought up here in the state of Arizona. So let's kind of give a summary of the things we've been talking about. I mean, you've been bringing up a wide variety, a plethora of subjects here on the Dr. Sky Experience. America goes back to the moon. This is interesting. And I remember, we've had here on this particular radio show and others, Frank Borman I knew as an astronaut from Apollo 8. And so much of the crew there, that was so amazing. And I know many people can think back to the day when they were orbiting the moon. I can't even imagine this. I was just a kid, and we're watching television, and they're reading from the Bible as they're going around the moon. Borman, Lovell, and Anders. That, to me, was just incredible. And these astronauts will do something similar, but it's been, 54 years? That's a long time.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I know Harrison Schmitt, who was on the last mission to the moon. He was the only scientist to walk on the moon. He has a PhD in geology. I had to introduce him at a conference and had dinner with him. He was walking on the moon in 1972. So that was 54 years ago. And so that was the last time we were on the moon. And he's still alive, actually. And he also, by the way, is a climate realist, and he speaks at the Heartland conferences. Heartland have another one of their international climate change conferences coming up in Washington, D.C. around the 7th or 8th of April. Actually, I'll be speaking there, and I hope Harrison Schmitt is too. So,
he's an amazing guy.
Time period.
No, you're absolutely right. We've run into him, and I've interviewed him, and we've met, actually, and it's very interesting. I didn't really recognize him. It was at ASU here, where they have a special planetary sciences program, a very interesting one. And it's the home base of something, ladies and gentlemen, called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. What's that? It's a thing maybe the size of a small SUV that's orbiting the moon. And yes, it's actually imaged the landing sites of where the Apollo astronauts landed. This stuff is there. But here I am walking in there one day, and I see a guy, older gentleman, dressed in very casual, golf shorts and kind of a Hawaiian-type shirt. And I looked and I said, that face, I said to myself, that's familiar. And guess who it is? Dr. Harrison Schmitt. What a guy. And a great, and a funny personality too. I mean, he takes his moon mission seriously, and was once a United States Senator from the state of New Mexico, the land of enchantment. What a guy.
Yeah. Anybody who has a chance to meet an Apollo astronaut, there's only 3 or 4 still living. These are amazing people. Interesting you mentioned Arizona State University, because there's an historian there by the name of Stephen Pine. And I have a quote from him, which I think is really good because it summarizes the whole thing. Choosing to explore the solar, he says this, Dr. Stephen Pine, choosing to explore the solar system will not by itself assure us continued status as a world civilization, but choosing not to explore will ensure that we will not retain that stature.
Amazing.
Okay, so he's actually looked at the history of exploration and written a very good book on it, talking about how exploration revitalizes a society. Okay, it brings in new information and new materials and new ideas which challenge the status quo, and it's very healthy for our society to continue to do that.
Very well said, Tom Harris. Before the show runs out here, I just wanted to bring up more of a political side of the equation here. One of your articles that you've written too, and part of the other side of the story, the podcast, entitled You Know It Well, by withdrawing from the climate treaty, President Trump ends America's UN climate change nightmare. Talk about this, because that's a controversial thing to many people who may disagree with what you might be talking about. But let's hear what this article's about.
Yeah, for sure. This treaty that we're talking about, not the Paris Agreement. I mean, that was one treaty, but we're talking about the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the underlying treaty of all UN climate treaties. It was the underlying treaty for Kyoto Protocol, Cancun Agreement, Paris Agreement, et cetera. It goes on. They're all based on the Framework Convention. And the problem with the Framework Convention is it treats developing and developed countries totally differently. Okay, Article 4 in this treaty that Trump pulled us out of, or you have to give a year's warning, I believe, to get out, but we're getting out, which is wonderful. I mean the United States. It says that developing countries have an out clause. Their first and overriding priority is not reduction of greenhouse gases, but poverty alleviation and development. So what's going to happen by 2030 when all those countries within the Framework Convention on Climate Change, they all say to China, look, you agreed in the Paris Agreement to cap your emissions in the year 2030. They're going to soar right through that. They're going to massively increase them. And what they'll say is, look, Article 4 says our first priority is not greenhouse gas reduction, it's poverty alleviation and development. And the best way to pull our people out of poverty is to build as many coal stations as we can. Now, Trump knows that that is completely unfair because, of course, China is now the world's leading emitter. And if you think that CO2 matters,
that's right.
If you think CO2 matters, then of course China should be held to limits. But they're not. And so Trump is pulling them out, and that is wonderful. We've been advocating that for 20 years.
Well, that's powerful stuff, and I'm sure there's controversy around just what you said, but the interesting thing is learning much more about what's really going on behind the scenes. I just would hope and pray, I'll do that and say pray again, or prayer, that we have the opportunity to have these civil conversations, because again, you know, not that I'm the expert on this, that's why we bring people onto this radio show. You can disagree with the host and say the program's great or it's not, and how can anybody say it's a horrible show if they were to say that? Because it's mostly people's opinions and great guests. That's why I'm sitting here behind the microphone, to bring on those people that have much more knowledge base than myself, and humbly to say it, just like you, Tom Harris, and many, many others that join us here on the Dr. Sky Experience. But here's something interesting, too. When we talk about all these things that are changing in the world, the whole thing goes back to the common sense concept. It all goes back to the art of debate. And again, I couldn't, you know, I'm repeating myself, but for a good reason, I believe, and I think you'd agree, that seriously, the art of debate, I think, is sadly lacking in so many things. You know, why is it that, well, all of a sudden we have to grab rocks and bricks and start burning things down? That's not really what it should be about, no doubt. So how do we get back to the whole concept of teaching this to young people and even seniors, you know, all the way up there, that the art of debate should come to us in a dialogue with critical thinking? Or am I too optimistic here on this radio show?
Yeah, I think that we have to encourage debate. And in fact, it reminds me of a line from Star Trek, okay? The Next Generation. Data was assigned the job of evacuating a colony because an alien species that regarded human as vermin just to be exterminated had agreed with the Federation they were going to come back and take over the planet, and any humans that were left were going to be killed. And Data went down to organize an evacuation of the colony that was there, but they didn't want to hear that. And in fact, they kept telling him to shut up, shut up, shut up. And he finally said to them, and this is what really is important to bring up for the climate debate. When they try to shut you up, you should say exactly what Data said. Data said to the colonists, is your point of view so weak it cannot withstand rational debate? Mm-hmm. At which point they lasered him. Okay? So they totally shut him up because their point of view was so weak that they couldn't debate it. So, I mean, the fact is, when people go to public hearings and they're booed for expressing a different point of view, I think that what they have to point out to people is, look, the great scientists through history are great because they questioned the status quo. If we start not questioning, then we stop advancing, and society becomes like an ancient, archaic society without advancement, and this is very unhealthy. So let's debate. Let's be respectful. Let's politely.
Yes.
We can agree to disagree. Then that's fine, but we don't have to be disagreeable.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And that's, I think, what the world needs now. Not only love, sweet love, but it needs the ability for common sense. And that goes into the realm of common sense, where so many people think, as we've talked about before, don't fall for the Dunning-Kruger effect and quickly identify it. So people who just tuned in, what the heck is he talking about? The Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, he found in his research, Dunning and Kruger, the two scientists, they found that the less people knew about a subject, the more confident they were that they were right. And it's hilarious because as a scientist or as anybody learns more and more about a topic, they come to realize how little they do know. And of course, that's the beauty of space exploration. It brings us completely to confront the cosmos and the unbelievable uncertainty and new discoveries that are out there. It really makes people humble. I think that one of the benefits of the space program is humility. It's going to make us humble and recognize that we have an infinite universe to explore. We don't know much, so let's go.
Tom Harris, always a privilege and honor. His website, icsc-canada.com. Consider him a friend of the show, and hope you do, ladies and gentlemen. And the art of debate. Let's focus on how we can do that and teach our children or learn ourselves to agree to disagree, but not to burn things down and blow things up without knowing, and don't fall for the Dunning-Kruger effect. Thank you, Tom Harris. Always a privilege and honor to have you here on the Dr. Sky Experience.
That was fun.
Thank you so much, and have a good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, a sincere shout-out to owner and operator John Katsimatidis and family, and also from the executive staff, Chad Lopez, for having the opportunity here that they've bestowed on me to be behind this particular microphone here on Talk Radio 77 WABC, as we call it, the Powerhouse Blowtorch. This 77 WABC broadcasting where from the center of the universe, New York City, to you, the nation, the world, and I'm sure out deeper into the cosmos. And of course, proudly, we pass the torch of conversation to TJ McCormick for the other side of midnight as we move through time and space, ladies and gentlemen. My email, drsky@wabcradio.com. And we'll see you tomorrow with a conversation on the killing of the bees. Why are bees disappearing all over the world? You'll be most fascinated, I'm sure, when you tune into the Dr. Sky Experience in less than 24 hours. Have a good morning, stay warm, clear skies, and above all, good health to each and every one of you.
Thanks for listening to the Dr. Sky Experience. You can hear the Dr. Sky Experience Saturday mornings, midnight to 2 a.m. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social, on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?